This video is sponsored by PCBWay, so before we get started, let's thank them for supporting us. If you're not familiar with PCBWay, their goal is to be the most professional PCB manufacturer for prototyping and low-volume production work in the world. New customers get a $5 bonus on their first order. Thank you, PCBWay! A few weeks ago, David and I decided it would be cool to build an arcade version of PETSCII Robots. If you haven't seen part 1 of this video, you should check it out. I'll put a link in the description. We partnered with Mike Woods, who owns my favorite arcade in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. He calls it the Electric Starship. If you haven't been there, you should totally consider a visit. A few months ago, I bought an HP Latex large format printer. We used this printer to print templates and arcade cabinet skins for our customers. So, the first thing I did was print out a template for the PETSCII Robots cabinet. This will make it much easier to cut out the side panels. I placed the side panel on a sheet of 3/4 inch MDF and held it in place temporarily with some masking tape. I could then use some Super 77 spray adhesive on the backside of the template and roll it back into place on the MDF. The jigsaw is my tool of choice when cutting out panels using paper templates. Anywhere the curves are too sharp, I drilled some relief holes in order to turn the blade around. And just like that, we have our first side panel. Anywhere there were rounded corners, I used my palm sander to round them over, and then I gave the entire edge a quick sanding to remove any marks left by the jigsaw blade. Now we have our first panel cut out, but we need to make a duplicate of it. Now I could just print out another template on the printer and use the jigsaw and go through all of that again. Or I can do it really fast with a flush trim bit and a router using this as the template. Since the bearing is on the bottom of my flush trim bit, I placed the original side panel underneath a second sheet of MDF. After clamping everything in place, I ran the router all the way around the original side panel. This results in a second side panel that is an identical copy of the first one. Next up, I started gluing on the cleats. The cleats will be how we connect the side panels to the front, bottom, and top panels. As always, I used glue and brad nails to hold things together. You can make an arcade without a brad nailer, you'll just need to let the glue dry between each step. To keep the cabinet square and aligned, I clamped in these corner braces while the glue dries. Arcades used in commercial settings get moved around a lot. In order to make this process simpler, I decided to put grab handles into the top of the cabinet. I drilled some large holes with my Forstner bits and then connected them with the jigsaw. I also rounded over the edge of the handles so it would be gentler on your hands and fingers. I then went on to installing the rest of the panels in the arcade using the same methods. Okay, I want to show you guys a little trick that I like to do. You know, sometimes you need to space something a certain distance apart, and it's just not ideal to try to get a tape measure or something else in there, and you're going to always be off by like a 32nd or a 16th of an inch. Well, what I like to do to make it super easy is just to cut that dimension into a little template using the table saw. So in this case, this is 4 5/8 inches tall, and I need to put on a cleat. And so what I can do now is simply put the cleat, put the spacer that I just made, and then put the cleat on using the spacer block, because it's going to line everything up for me. And then all I have to do is glue and brad nail that, and I am done. No measuring, nothing. I use this trick all the time. Not only is it a huge time saver, but it's also far more accurate than trying to measure. And since I have to do this operation on both sides of the cabinet, it's 2 times more efficient. With the cabinet mostly complete, I moved on to making the control panel. The control panel is going to swing open using a piano hinge, but I need to cut it down to size first. I first marked it with a Sharpie, and then I cut it with my portable bandsaw. And now you can see how it's going to work. I also added these latches to lock the control panel in place. These can only be unlocked from the rear of the cabinet after removing the back door. This will keep people from opening the control panel without the key. Next up, I went to work on making the face frame that will hold the CRT bezel. On my router table, I created a 1/8 inch deep slot, that's 3 mm. This slot is to countersink the bezel. I saved this panel for last because I wasn't sure what style or size of speakers I would be using, but this will indeed be the speaker panel. Next up, I went to work making the braces that will hold the heavy CRT in place. The CRT will bolt to these insert nuts. I used a combination of glue and 3-inch screws to secure them. I wanted this to be rock solid and last forever. Again, you can see I have used a temporary piece of MDF that will work as an alignment jig. And now I can remove the temporary jig. You can see the monitor has these 4 mounting holes on the frame. These will align with the 4 insert nuts I put in the cabinet. Since David was at the pub today, we laid the cabinet on its back so I could install the casters and the front feet. I installed the casters using 4 bolts with nuts and lock washers on the inside of the cabinet. The front feet also use insert nuts, so I added them to a spacer block, and then I glued and screwed the spacer block into the cabinet. While the cabinet was laying on its side, this was an opportune time to route for T-molding. I then went to work on building the back door of the cabinet. Since the back door of the cabinet will also act as the ventilation port, I wanted to put some slots in the back of it. I used a flush trim bit with a top bearing and a circle template I got from Rockler to cut out some rounded rectangles. Just for aesthetics reasons, I added a small roundover to each slot. On the back side of the door, I'm going to use this perforated mesh. This will allow for airflow, but keep things from being dropped into the cabinet by little kids. I cut the wire mesh into 2 small squares and then used my staple gun to secure it in place. I then went to work making the top of the control panel, again using a template I made on my large format printer. These punch marks will make it easier to align the brad points of the Forstner bits. With Forstner bits and MDF, I like to go slow, so not to overheat the bits and dull them prematurely. Since our artwork is going to roll over the front of the control panel, I added a roundover to the front of it to make it look better. I then glued and brad nailed it to complete the control panel. I used a 5-inch hole saw to cut out the holes for the speakers. I then added caulking to all of the corners, wiping away any excess with a wet rag. A good caulking job can really make your cabinet pop, as it hides any imperfections in your joints. Unfortunately, I decided to build this cabinet during an oil-based paint shortage, and I was unable to get any primer. This is fine, it just means our first coat of paint is going to be the primer, and we're going to have to sand between coats, as MDF will tend to soak up the paint and create a rough surface texture. Just add some extra labor, but otherwise will make no difference. Since the bezel was an ugly brown, I shot it with a coat of flat black spray paint. Anywhere the arcade cabinet is getting a vinyl overlay, I went with white paint. I was afraid since we're using really light colors, the black might darken the colors if it happened to bleed through the vinyl. Again, I did a quick sanding with 220 grit between the coats of paint. Since we're going to have many items plugged into this cabinet, I added a large 10-outlet power strip to handle everything. I created a paper template of the Amiga 500 mounting holes, and then used that to transfer the holes to the cabinet. I drilled out the holes and then installed very small versions of the same insert nuts we used to hold in the monitor. These drive in with a hex wrench, and then I can add these cap head screws that use the same size hex wrench to attach the Amiga motherboard. Along with cap screws, I used 6mm standoffs and nylon washers to securely mount the Amiga 500. This cabinet may get transported all over the country, so I wanted to make sure things would be solid. I drilled 4 holes into the top of a new brick power supply, and then screwed it into the side of the cabinet. To keep things as neat as possible, I went with these 12-inch power cords. At the top of the cabinet, I installed the speaker amplifier. and then that connects to the Amiga using RCA cables. I made custom speaker cables using ferrule and spade connectors. I like to label all of my cables to make troubleshooting easier in the future. Over on the table saw, I cut out the plexiglass for the marquee using a special acrylic and plastic cutting blade. The blade has a flat top that leaves a clean edge and won't melt the material. I used a ruler to perfectly align the printed marquee, taped it in place, and then slowly applied it to the back piece of acrylic. I then sandwiched this with a top sheet of acrylic, and damn does it look beautiful. The marquee itself mounts into these plastic channels that clamp the marquee into place. They screw in from the top and the bottom. I then applied the vinyl artwork to the control panel. This process scares a lot of people, but it's really not that hard. Just go slow and keep the vinyl taut. I wrapped the vinyl over the sides and then cut out all of the holes for the buttons and joysticks. None of this has to be clean because no one will ever see it. The buttons David picked for the fire buttons are supposed to be countersunk into the wood, but we decided they would look better if they were raised like the rest of the buttons on the arcade. So over to my 3D printer and I made some blue PLA spacers to fit under the button heads. We needed a way to connect the Amiga 500's keyboard controller to the cabinet's control panel. Kevin Williams over at TechSelect designed this adapter board, and the sponsor of this video, PCBWay, produced it for us. The board maps specific keys on the keyboard matrix to these connectors, which will then connect to our control panel. I used the same mounting method and mounted this board next to the Amiga 500 in the cabinet. From here, I attached the control panel to the cabinet and screwed it into place permanently. Hey, you can start to imagine how this is going to look. I built a wiring harness for each section of the control panel. I again used ferrules on the side for the screw terminals and spade connectors on the side that connects to the buttons. With the cabinet now laying on its side, David and I went to work installing the side panel artwork. Again, all printed on my large format printer. By the way, thanks to Anders Enger Jensen for doing these layouts for us. While I kept it taut, David used a roller to apply the vinyl. I like to work in sections when installing artwork, working with just a smaller section at a time. Since everything I print is on air release vinyl, it means removing the bubbles is as simple as rolling over them with a roller. Air release vinyl has really changed the artwork game when it comes to easy installation. I printed all of the artwork with a 1-inch bleed. This allowed us to trim it to the perfect size on the back and the bottom. On the top and the front, I left the bleed and rolled it over the edges. This sandwiches it between the T-molding for a super clean look. I find using a rubber mallet takes all of the work out of installing T-molding. So I decided it was time to get my workout for the day, and I installed the CRT into the cabinet. It just screws into those 4 insert nuts we installed earlier. To cover the bezel, we created this Bezel Overlay that has some credits and instructions on it. Then, over on the table saw using that acrylic blade, I cut a thick piece of acrylic sheet to cover everything. The overlay and acrylic sheet get locked into place when you close the control panel. So, with everything complete, I put the back cover onto the cabinet, and then Mike Woods and Brendan from the Electric Starship Arcade came and picked it up. Thankfully, Mike has this big box truck with the lift gate on the back of it. And a few minutes later, we arrived at the Electric Starship Arcade in Haltom City and put the cabinet out on the floor before the arcade opened.
Okay, so we've got the PETSCII Robots set up here in the arcade, and I just wanted to mention that we actually made a number of software changes, even though this is running the Amiga version. So for example, you'll see it's basically just showing the main screen here, but then every few seconds it swaps over and shows some just little information about how the game is played. This is both a combination of a screensaver, to keep the CRT from burning in, but also as kind of a, there's not an instruction manual for people to walk up. So this is just something to help people understand a little bit more about what they might want to do when playing the game, because, not everything is going to be obvious to somebody who hasn't played it before. The other thing that we did is if you're playing the game and someone just comes over here and then they just walk away and leave it sitting there, after about 60 seconds, it will actually return back to the main menu. Because, people do that a lot in arcades, right? So you wouldn't want to just leave it sitting there. You can also exit this. So we made like a change here, like left and right for yes and no, since there's no keyboard to push Y and N. So I can do that. But other than that, it pretty much operates more or less like the regular game. So the other thing is, of course, all of the buttons are labeled, which, that's one of the biggest problems with not having a user manual. Is when people are playing on a computer or something where they have a hand controller, because they don't know what all the buttons do. But at least here in the arcade, everything is labeled. So they know this is fire, change weapon, change out, move, search, use, and even got the map button up here. So hopefully that will also at least alleviate that need for a user's manual a little bit. So anyway, here it is. This is the first day of being here. I don't know how many people are going to come play this. Honestly, I'm not really expecting a huge number of people to come play it, because let's face it, people come in here and they want to play their favorite games like Pac-Man and Cubert or whatever that they're familiar with, and nobody's going to ever heard of this. So, I'm not expecting like a long line of people waiting to play it. Nevertheless, I'm going to hang around and just see who might walk up to it and just kind of figure out what their experience is going to be.
Well, the tables have turned. We just got PETSCII in yesterday. It's a brand new old stock monitor, and I think it has just fried. There's no video and there's smoke everywhere, but I don't see anything obvious on the board, so we'll have to figure that out.
Well, it has been a few days since the PETSCII Robots monitor went up in smoke, and we think we've narrowed down the problem to a bad flyback. And that's really not that uncommon in these old stock monitors. They sat in a warehouse for this probably sat in a warehouse for 30 years and was never used. And so, like all of the goo inside all these components tends to get hard and dry out and all of that. So I didn't want to delay the video another couple, 3 weeks while we figured this out and get it fixed. I really encourage you to go visit the Electric Starship Arcade in Haltom City. But if the only reason you're going there is to see PETSCII Robots, there'll be a link in the description that will give you an update at any time and let you know if the PETSCII Robots Arcade is back in service. Well, there'll be an update on my Instagram and of course on my blog, and I will see you in the next video.